Welcome to History Point. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten and extraordinary stories from the pages of real history, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a video like this one. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on 26 real circus performers whose stories were buried, erased, or simply forgotten by mainstream history. These were not myths or legends. These were real human beings with real struggles, real triumphs, and real legacies that deserve to be remembered. Let us begin. Performer 1. Julia Pastrana, the Tragic Beauty. Julia Pastrana, born in 1834 in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, was one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking figures in the entire history of circus performance. She was born with hypertrichosis terminalis, a rare genetic condition that caused thick, dark hair to grow across her entire face and body, combined with gingival hyperplasia, which enlarged her gums and lips in a way that completely altered her facial structure. Despite these conditions, Julia was a woman of remarkable talent and fierce intelligence. She was a trained opera singer, a graceful dancer, and a linguist who spoke 3 languages fluently. She performed in theaters and circuses across Europe and America, where audiences were both shocked and mesmerized by her presence. Promoters cruelly billed her as the ugliest woman in the world, while yet Julia carried herself with extraordinary dignity at every performance. She fell in love with her manager, Theodore Lent, and gave birth to a son who sadly also had hypertrichosis and died just 3 days after being born. Julia herself passed away only 5 days later from childbirth complications. But the horror did not end there. Her manager had both her body and her baby's body embalmed and displayed them publicly for a financial profit. Julia Pastrana is remembered as one of the most exploited yet most courageous women in circus history, a true artist whose extraordinary talent was far greater than the cruelty of those who profited from her pain. Performer 2. William Henry Johnson, Zip the Pinhead. William Henry Johnson, known to the entire world as Zip the Pinhead, was born in 1857 in Bound Brook, New Jersey, with microcephaly, a neurological condition that resulted in a smaller than normal head and some degree of cognitive limitation. P.T. Barnum discovered Johnson early and constructed one of the most elaborate deceptions in entertainment history, falsely claiming that Zip was a missing link between humans and apes, supposedly captured somewhere in the jungles of Africa. Despite the deeply dishonest marketing, Johnson became one of Barnum's most beloved and longest-serving performers. And he worked in show business for over 60 years, outlasting almost every performer of his era. Those who knew him personally described him as a witty, playful man with a sharp sense of humor who genuinely loved performing for crowds. He reportedly said on his deathbed with a grin, "Well, we fooled them for a long time." William Henry Johnson is remembered as one of the most iconic and enduring figures in all of sideshow history. A man who somehow managed to turn exploitation into a genuinely joyful and surprisingly triumphant career. Performer 3. Percilla Lauther, the Monkey Girl. Percilla Lauther, born in 1911 in Puerto Rico, came into the world with hypertrichosis, the same rare condition that caused thick hair to grow across her face and body. Her father, unwilling to raise her in a small community where constant stares and ridicule made daily life unbearable, eventually enrolled her in a traveling circus where she quickly became known as the Monkey Girl. But Percilla's story is far more than a story of exploitation. Inside the circus world, she found something that most people spend their entire lives searching for: genuine love. She met Emmitt Bejano, known as the alligator-skinned man, who had ichthyosis, a condition that caused his skin to form dry, scaly plates across his body. The two fell deeply in love, married, and spent over 50 years together, performing side by side and building a life most people would envy. They became famously known as the world's strangest married couple. Percilla Lauther is remembered as a timeless symbol of love and resilience, living proof that human connection has absolutely nothing to do with appearance. Performer 4. Millie Christine McCoy, the two-headed nightingale. Millie Christine McCoy, born on July 11, 1851, in Welch's Creek, North Carolina. Were conjoined twins born into the brutal reality of American slavery in the Deep South. From the very first moments of their lives, they were treated not as human beings, but as property, sold multiple times as infants, with their bodies regarded as objects of financial value. Yet despite this almost unimaginable beginning, Millie and Christine refused to be defined by the cruelty of the world around them. The sisters became classically trained singers, dancers, and musicians. They spoke 5 languages and toured internationally, performing before enormous audiences across Europe and even appearing before Queen Victoria herself. They used their substantial earnings to purchase land in North Carolina and build a life of genuine dignity and independence. Millie Christine McCoy is remembered as one of the most remarkable and inspiring stories not just in circus history, but in all of American history. A true testament to the unbreakable power of the human spirit in the face of slavery, exploitation, and injustice. Performer 5. Carl Herman Unthan, the Armless Wonder. Carl Herman Unthan, born in 1848 in No Outs in what is now Latvia, entered the world without arms. His father, a determined schoolteacher, flatly refused to allow Carl to be treated as helpless or incapable, insisting from the very beginning that his son learn to do everything for himself using his feet. And Carl did exactly that, with results that left the entire world speechless. He taught himself to play the violin entirely with his toes, eventually reaching a level of technical skill that astonished professional concert musicians across Europe. He performed in legitimate theaters and concert halls, not just circuses, where sophisticated audiences were left completely without words. He could also write, load, and fire a rifle, shave himself, and manage every task of daily life with extraordinary precision and dexterity. He later wrote an autobiography titled The Armless Fiddler, in which he passionately argued against pitying people with physical disabilities, insisting that challenge and adversity are the very foundations of true character. Carl Herman Unthan is remembered as one of the most dignified and intellectually powerful performers in all of circus history, a man who proved beyond all doubt that limitation is often nothing more than a failure of imagination. Performer 6. Cryo Farini, the Missing Link. Cryo Farini, introduced to European audiences in the early 1880s, was presented by circus promoter Guillermo Farini as a mysterious creature discovered deep in the jungles of Siam, supposedly a primitive and barely human being who bridged the evolutionary gap between apes and mankind. In reality, Cryo was a young girl, most likely from Thailand, who possessed an astonishing degree of natural double-jointedness that allowed her to fold herself into positions that appeared anatomically impossible. She could dislocate her joints at will, turn her legs completely around, and move her body in ways that defied every expectation of human anatomy. Farini legally adopted Cryo and trained her rigorously as a performer, and she spent decades touring with circuses across America and Europe. Despite the wild and deeply dehumanizing mythology constructed around her, those who actually worked alongside Cryo described her as warm, funny, and entirely unmistakably human. She performed well into old age, eventually becoming a deeply beloved figure within backstage circus communities everywhere she went. Cryo Farini is remembered as one of the most physically fascinating performers of the entire 19th century. A woman whose real story was infinitely more compelling than anything her promoters ever invented. Performer 7. Fedor Jefticheu, Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. Fedor Jefticheu, born in 1868 in St. Petersburg, Russia, had one of the most visually striking appearances in the entire history of circus entertainment. He was born with hypertrichosis, the same rare genetic condition that covered his entire face, head, and body with long, flowing, soft hair that unmistakably resembled the coat of a large dog or lion. His father, Adrian, had the exact same condition and had already been performing in European circuses for years by the time Fedor was a young boy. P.T. Barnum acquired Fedor in 1884 and completely reinvented him as Jojo the dog-faced boy, fabricating an elaborate false backstory claiming he had been discovered living as a wild animal in a remote Russian forest. The deception worked with spectacular success. Audiences across America were instantly captivated, and Fedor quickly became one of Barnum's most recognizable and highest-paid performers of the era. In private life, Fedor was thoughtful and quietly intelligent, reportedly speaking 4 languages with considerable fluency. Fedor Jeftichev is remembered as one of the most visually iconic figures in all of Barnum's legendary history. A man whose private intelligence and dignity stood in powerful and moving contrast to the wild mythology that surrounded him in public. Performer 8, Betty Lou Williams, the girl with a parasitic twin. Betty Lou Williams, born in 1932 in Albany, Georgia, was one of 12 children in an impoverished farming family. She entered the world carrying something no one had ever quite encountered before: a parasitic twin that grew directly from her left side, consisting of 2 small legs, a one arm, and a partial head buried within her torso. Rather than hide herself away, Betty Lou entered the sideshow world when she was just 2 years old and rapidly became one of the most popular and talked about attractions in the entire country. But Betty Lou was celebrated for far more than her remarkable appearance. Everyone who knew her personally described her as joyful, generous, and genuinely kind. She dedicated a significant portion of her performance earnings to paying for her siblings' college educations and supporting her struggling family through poverty. She quietly dreamed of one day becoming a nurse. Tragically, Betty Lou Williams died in 1955 at the age of just 23 from complications following a surgical attempt to remove the parasitic twin. Betty Lou Williams is remembered as one of the most beloved and warm-hearted performers in all of sideshow history. A young woman of extraordinary character whose generosity of spirit made her far more remarkable than any physical condition ever could. Performer 9, Lalu the Hindu, the man carrying a second body. Lalu, born in approximately 1874 in Oudh, India, possessed one of the most medically astonishing physical conditions ever documented in either scientific or circus history. Growing directly from his chest and abdomen was the nearly complete body of a parasitic twin, including 2 legs, a one arm, and a partially formed torso. Most strikingly, the twins' limbs could move involuntarily on their own, a fact that caused profound confusion and fascination among every medical examiner who studied Lalu in person. He arrived in the United States in the late 1880s and quickly joined several of the most prominent sideshow circuits in the country, becoming one of the most examined and discussed human curiosities of his entire generation. Physicians from across America formally requested access to study him, and detailed documentation of his extraordinary condition was published in respected medical journals of the time. Lalu is remembered as one of the most medically significant figures in the entire history of the sideshow world, a man whose very existence pushed the known boundaries of biological understanding and whose case is still referenced by medical researchers to this day. Performer 10, Frida Pushnik, the incomplete Little Miss. Frida Pushnik, born on February 13, 1923 in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, came into the world without arms or legs. Her parents were immediately told by doctors that she would never be able to care for herself, live independently, or contribute meaningfully to the world around her. Those doctors were spectacularly and completely wrong. Frida taught herself to use her torso and shoulder stumps with breathtaking skill, writing letters, sewing, and performing elaborate card tricks with a level of precision that left trained observers genuinely amazed. She joined the Ringling Bros and Barnum and Bailey Circus in 1936 at just 13 years old and remained a professional performer for nearly 2 full decades. Far from serving as a passive display, Frida actively and enthusiastically engaged with her audiences, signing autographs by holding a pen in her mouth and charming every person she met with her sharp wit and reliably cheerful personality. After retiring from performance, she wrote extensively and thoughtfully about her years within the circus world. Frida Pushnik is remembered as one of the most fiercely independent and courageously spirited performers in the entire history of the circus, a woman who refused every limitation the world ever dared to place upon her. Chess performer 11. Grace McDaniels, the mule-faced woman. Grace McDaniels, born in 1888 in Elma, Iowa, had a severe condition that caused extreme facial disfigurement, including massive tumors that distorted her features in ways that genuinely shocked even the most experienced circus audiences of the era. Promoters assigned her the brutally cruel nickname, the Mule-Faced Woman, a title that Grace accepted with a composure and even a quiet humor that deeply surprised those around her. She performed in circuses and sideshows throughout the 1930s and 1940s. And despite the harshness of her public image, those who spent time with her privately described a woman of extraordinary quiet dignity and deeply warm maternal devotion. She was completely devoted to her son Leela, who worked in the circus alongside her as her manager and personal protector, making sure no one ever treated his mother with disrespect. So Grace absolutely refused to allow anyone to speak unkindly about her appearance in her presence, calmly insisting that she was precisely as God had made her, and that was more than enough. Grace McDaniels is remembered as a figure of profound, quiet strength, a woman who faced the cruelest public judgment imaginable every single day of her life, and still chose to live openly, proudly, and with remarkable grace. Performer 12. Emmitt Bejano, the alligator-skinned man. Emmitt Bejano, born in 1906 in Florida, had a severe and striking form of ichthyosis, a genetic skin disorder that caused the skin across his entire body to develop thick, hard, scale-like plates, giving him an appearance that his promoters openly compared to that of a living alligator. But the truly remarkable element of Emmitt's story has nothing to do with his skin at all. It is his love story that makes him unforgettable. When Emmitt met Percilla Lauther, the monkey girl, inside the circus world that both of them called home, the two immediately recognized in each other something that the outside world had rarely offered either of them: complete and genuine acceptance. They fell deeply in love, married in 1938, and went on to build one of the most enduring and genuinely devoted partnerships in the entire history of American circus entertainment. Everyone who knew them described their marriage as one of the most real and loving relationships they had ever witnessed in their lives. After retiring from performance, the two grew old together quietly in Florida, inseparable until the very end. Emmitt Bejano is remembered as living proof that love is the single most extraordinary human capability of all, one that absolutely no physical condition will ever have the power to diminish. Performer 13. Lucia Zarate, the tiniest human being in recorded history. Lucia Zarate, born on January 2, 1864, in San Carlos, Mexico, holds a record that may genuinely never be broken. She is documented as the smallest adult human being in all of recorded human history, weighing just over 1 kilogram and standing a remarkable 43 centimeters tall when fully grown. Even within a circus world that celebrated performers of extraordinarily small stature, Lucia existed in a category that was entirely and absolutely her own. She traveled to the United States in 1876 and instantly became a national sensation, performing before enormous and disbelieving crowds who could barely process what they were witnessing with their own eyes. Despite her incredibly fragile physical form, Lucia was described by all who knew her as lively, sharp-witted, and bursting with personality. She earned substantial income from her performances and was widely considered the undeniable highlight of every exhibition she ever joined. Tragically, Lucia Zarate died in 1890 at the age of 26 when the circus train she was traveling on became completely snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She died of hypothermia, her tiny body ultimately unable to endure the brutal cold. Lucia Zarate is remembered as the tiniest, the most fragile, and perhaps the most heartbreakingly poignant figure in the entire history of human curiosity shows. Performer 14. Maximo and Bartola, the last Aztecs. Maximo and Bartola were two microcephalic performers who arrived in the United States around 1850, introduced by none other than P.T. Barnum himself as the last surviving members of an ancient and mysterious Aztec race discovered deep within the impenetrable jungles of Central America. In reality, the two were almost certainly from El Salvador, brought to America by a Salvadoran promoter who understood precisely how profitable exotic mythology could be. Their genuine identities, real names, and true origins were all deliberately concealed and buried to protect the sensational story that made them such a commercially spectacular attraction. Both had microcephaly, which gave them the characteristically small and tapered skulls that showmen of the era referred to in their promotional materials as pinheads. They performed at Barnum's American Museum for years, consistently drawing enormous and fascinated crowds from across the country. Maximo and Bartola are remembered today as deeply fascinating and profoundly misrepresented figures in early American entertainment history. Powerful symbols of both the insatiable public curiosity that made the sideshow world possible and the often dark exploitation that lay at its very foundation. Performer 15. Major Mite, the world's tiniest showman. Major Mite, whose real name was Clarence Howerton, was born in 1913 in Warrens, Wisconsin. As an adult, he stood just 23 inches tall and weighed less than 7 pounds, making him one of the smallest human beings ever to have lived anywhere on Earth. Yet what Clarence completely lacked in physical size, he more than compensated for with sheer force of personality and raw, natural showmanship. He joined the circus at a very young age and rapidly became one of the most genuinely beloved little people performers in all of American circus history. He possessed a stage presence that was nothing short of enormous, a booming voice that the people in the very back row could hear with perfect clarity, and an instinctive gift for physical comedy that made him a reliable crowd favorite everywhere he ever performed. He toured with the Ringling Brothers, Circus for years, and continued performing well into the 1970s, outlasting nearly every single one of his contemporaries by decades. Major Mite is remembered as one of the most joyful, most entertaining, and most genuinely lovable figures in the entire history of the American circus, a man for whom the stage was clearly, undeniably, and completely his natural home. Performer 16. Jack Earle, the gentle giant poet. Jacob Ehrlich, who performed professionally under the name Jack Earle, was born in Denver, Colorado in 1906. A sudden and dramatic growth surge during his early teenage years, almost certainly caused by a pituitary gland disorder, rapidly pushed his height to 8 full feet, making him one of the tallest living human beings on the planet at the time. But unlike the many circus giants of his era who were deliberately portrayed as terrifying or monstrous to maximize audience shock, Jack consciously and carefully cultivated a public identity as the gentle giant. He was soft-spoken, quietly philosophical, and possessed a deep and passionate love for both poetry and painting. He wrote and published several collections of original verse during his lifetime and was considered a genuinely skilled visual artist by those who knew him personally. He toured with the Ringling Brothers Circus for over 15 years, using his extraordinary physical height to earn his living while simultaneously pursuing his considerable intellectual interests with complete seriousness. After eventually retiring from circus life, Jack went on to build a surprisingly successful career as a wine salesman in Texas. Jack Earle is remembered as one of the most unexpectedly cultured and quietly extraordinary figures in all of circus history. A true giant who understood that gentleness and intelligence stand far taller than any physical measurement. Performer 17. Otis Jordan, the Frog Boy. Otis Jordan, born in 1925 in Barnesville, Georgia, had arthrogryposis, a condition that caused severe and permanent contracture of his joints, leaving his arms and legs bent in ways that made conventional movement extremely difficult. But the remarkable thing about Otis was not his physical condition. It was his absolute refusal to allow that condition to define either his identity or his future. He developed an act built around his extraordinary ability to roll cigarettes and light them using only his lips and teeth, a feat of precision and dexterity that left audiences who had come prepared to stare, leaving instead with genuine, open-mouthed admiration. Otis performed for decades at state fairs and circuses all across America, building a devoted following of fans who came specifically to see him. In his later years, he became a passionate and outspoken public advocate for the rights and dignity of disabled performers everywhere. When disability rights campaigners attempted to have his act legally banned in the 1980s on the grounds that it was degrading, Otis fought back with fierce determination, insisting that performing was his freely chosen livelihood and that nobody had the right to take it from him. Otis Jordan is remembered as one of the most fiercely independent and uncompromising spirits in the entire history of the American sideshow. Performer 18. John Libera, the man who carried another man. John Libera, born in Rome, Italy in 1884, possessed one of the most anatomically astonishing physical conditions ever formally documented in the history of medicine. Attached permanently to his abdomen and chest was the nearly complete body of a parasitic twin, which Libera himself named Jacques. The twin was approximately 18 inches in length and had 4 distinct limbs that, while small and underdeveloped, were unmistakably real and plainly visible to anyone who looked. Libera joined circuses and traveling exhibitions in the early 20th century, quickly becoming one of the most examined, discussed, and argued over human curiosities on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. He developed an elaborate and highly theatrical stage persona, often wearing specially designed suits that dramatically alternated between concealing and suddenly revealing Jacques for maximum emotional effect on his audiences. Remarkably, Libera maintained a wife, had several children, and by all reliable accounts, lived an essentially normal and contented domestic life entirely outside of his performing career. John Libera is remembered as one of the most genuinely extraordinary figures in all of circus history, a man who carried a literal second human life within his own and somehow made peace with that extraordinary reality every single day. Performer 19. Matthew Buchinger, the Little Man of Nuremberg. Matthew Buchinger, born in 1674 in Ansbach, Germany, was one of the most genuinely astonishing human beings who ever walked this earth. And his remarkable story predates the formal circus tradition by well over a century. He was born completely without hands, forearms, or legs, and stood just 29 inches tall his entire life. Yet Buchinger proceeded to master a range of skills so broad and so deep that historians still have difficulty fully comprehending the scope of his achievement. He played more than a dozen distinct musical instruments, including instruments he personally invented and built himself. And he was a celebrated calligrapher and visual artist whose extraordinary handwriting and intricate miniature artwork are still preserved today in the collections of major museums around the world. He performed magic tricks, conjuring exhibitions, and bowling demonstrations before royalty and ordinary audiences with equal confidence and charm. He was married 4 times across the course of his long life and fathered at least 14 children. Matthew Buchinger is remembered as perhaps the single most accomplished individual with physical disabilities in the entirety of recorded human history, a man whose extraordinary capabilities demolished every boundary that nature had ever appeared to set around him. Performer 20, Ella Ewing, the Missouri Giantess. Ella Ewing, born on March 9, 1872, in Gorin, Missouri, knew from her earliest childhood years that she was fundamentally different from the people around her. A pituitary condition that emerged in her teenage years eventually pushed her height to an extraordinary 8 feet and 4 inches, making her one of the tallest women in all of recorded human history. But unlike many circus performers of her era who entered the entertainment world out of desperate poverty or a complete lack of alternatives, Ella chose performance deliberately, strategically, and entirely on her own terms. She negotiated her own contracts with complete confidence, insisted on compensation that properly reflected her extraordinary value as a performer, and was known throughout the industry as a remarkably sharp and thoroughly unsentimental businesswoman. She toured with Barnum and Bailey and multiple other major circus organizations across the country, and her striking image appeared on posters and promotional materials from coast to coast. In her private life, she was known as gentle, deeply religious, and extraordinarily close to her family, all for whom she had a specially constructed house built to accommodate her remarkable height. Ella Ewing is remembered as one of the most commanding, most self-determined, and most quietly dignified figures in the entire history of the American circus, a woman who stood above the entire world in every meaningful sense of the word. Performer 21. The Doll Family. The world's most famous little people. The Doll family, consisting of 4 siblings named Harry, Gracie, Tiny, and Daisy Earles, were born in Stolpen, Germany between 1902 and 1918, all 4 of them with a hereditary form of dwarfism that restricted their adult heights to between 2.5 and 3.5 feet. The family emigrated to the United States in the 1920s and made an immediate and lasting impact on the American circus world. Harry Earles became the most celebrated of the 4. So, starring memorably in the groundbreaking 1932 film Freaks, and later appearing in The Wizard of Oz as one of the iconic Munchkins, cementing his place permanently in popular cultural history. The family performed together as a unified and highly professional theatrical act for decades, presenting polished and sophisticated entertainment that clearly distinguished them from simple curiosity exhibitions. They were universally known for their meticulous professionalism, their distinctly European elegance and refinement, and their deliberately glamorous personal presentation. The Doll family is remembered as one of the most successful, most respected, and most genuinely dignified performing families in the entire history of the American circus, a remarkable group that transformed their shared physical difference into a truly enduring entertainment legacy that outlived them all. Performer 22. Mortado, the Human Fountain. Mortado, whose real name was Walter F. Hepworth, was born in approximately 1882 and became one of the most disturbing, most extreme, and most utterly unforgettable performers in the entire history of the sideshow world. Known everywhere, he performed as the Human Fountain. Mortado had holes surgically and permanently created through both of his hands and both of his feet. During each performance, specially made tubes were inserted into these permanent openings, and water was pumped through them under pressure, creating the unmistakable appearance of wounds bleeding or flowing freely in a deeply theatrical and deliberately provocative recreation of stigmata imagery. The act was considered profoundly shocking, even by the already extreme standards of the sideshow era, and attracted massive crowds of stunned spectators at every single venue where Mortado appeared. Medical professionals who formally examined him confirmed beyond any doubt that the openings in his hands and feet were entirely genuine, surgically created and permanently healed around their inserted tubes. Whether Mortado was driven to this extreme act by financial desperation, a hunger for notoriety, or some form of genuine showmanship that we cannot fully understand today, he endured a permanent and completely irreversible physical alteration in the name of performance art. Mortado is remembered as one of the most extreme and profoundly unsettling figures in all of human performance history, a man who gave his own body to his craft in the most literal sense imaginable. Performer 23. Cielo the Seal Boy. Stanley Barrett. Stanley Barrett, born in 1901 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had ectrodactyly, the same rare condition that would later bring a very different kind of notoriety to the performer Grady Stiles, causing his hands and feet to form in a manner that strikingly resembled the flippers of a seal. But where Grady Stiles' story descended into violence, tragedy, and darkness, Stanley Barrett's story is one of sustained and seemingly effortless warmth, humor, and genuine human connection. Known universally throughout the circus world as Cielo the Seal Boy, Stanley became one of the most deeply and sincerely beloved figures in the entire history of American sideshow entertainment. He had a generous and thoroughly infectious personality that put children and adults alike immediately at ease the moment they encountered him. He was celebrated for his relentless practical jokes, his completely genuine laugh, and the pure, unperformed joy he brought to every single performance throughout his career. And he spent over 4 decades in circus and sideshow entertainment, and eventually became a highly respected mentor to younger generations of performers who looked to him as a model of how to live this life with real dignity and real happiness. Cielo the Seal Boy is remembered as the warm, beating heart of the American sideshow, a man whose infectious and completely authentic joy in performance was the most extraordinary thing about him. Performer 24. Unzi the Albino, the image that history never forgot. Unzi, whose full name and precise origins remain a subject of genuine historical debate, was presented to circus audiences across the late 19th century as an Aboriginal Australian albino, a combination of physical characteristics that made him one of the most visually extraordinary and immediately captivating performers of his entire era. His long, dramatically flowing white hair contrasted sharply and breathtakingly against his darker skin tone, creating an appearance that the professional photographers of the period found essentially impossible to resist capturing on film. Unzi performed across the United States and throughout Europe during a period when both scientific curiosity and popular fascination with albinism were at their absolute peak. And despite the consistently condescending and often genuinely dehumanizing framing of his public exhibitions, Unzi adapted to his circumstances with notable skill and intelligence, using his strikingly unique visual presence to build a sustained and commercially successful entertainment career that lasted many years. His photographic portraits remain among the most visually distinctive and most frequently reproduced images from the entire golden age of the freak show era. Unzi is remembered as one of the most visually unforgettable circus figures of the entire 19th century, a man whose haunting image endured in the public imagination long after the details of his personal story had faded into obscurity. Performer 25. Pip and Flip, the last Aztec twins. Elvira and Jenny Lee Snow, who performed professionally under the stage names Pip and Flip, were sisters born in Georgia in approximately 1898 and 1901, both of them with microcephaly. They were brought into the sideshow world as very young children and, following a well-established tradition of deliberate deception, were promoted under the invented and entirely false identity of the last Aztec twins, a theatrical fiction that placed them within an exotic invented mythology entirely disconnected from their actual American origins. Despite this fundamentally dishonest presentation, Pip and Flip became genuinely and warmly beloved figures within the American circus community. They performed enthusiastically together for decades, developing a cheerful and engaging stage presence that consistently made audiences feel genuinely fond of them as people rather than simply curious about them as exhibits. They appeared in the landmark 1932 film Freaks, alongside numerous other extraordinary performers whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. Pip and Flip are remembered as enduring and deeply human symbols of the endlessly complicated and morally contradictory nature of the sideshow world, a world that simultaneously exploited and celebrated the people who were different, and in doing so, created one of the strangest, most fascinating, and most revealing chapters in the entire history of human entertainment. Performer 26. Friederike Gossmann, the Austrian giantess. Friederike Gossmann, born in the mid-1800s in Austria. Earle was one of the most imposing and commanding physical presences ever to grace the stages of European variety theater and traveling exhibition. Standing at well over 7 feet tall, she entered the exhibition circuit at a time when female performers of extraordinary physical stature were still a profoundly rare and startling attraction. Unlike many of her contemporaries who were displayed as passive and silent curiosities, Friederike was known for her active and articulate engagement with her audiences. She spoke with confidence, carried herself with deliberate and unmistakable elegance, and was known among fellow performers as a woman of considerable intelligence and dry, understated humor. She toured extensively across Central Europe and made several highly successful appearances in England, where the press described her in consistently respectful terms as a figure of genuine theatrical authority and natural presence. Her story was largely forgotten by mainstream historical accounts, buried under the more commercially prominent names of the American circus tradition. Friederike Gossmann is remembered as a pioneering figure in the European exhibition tradition, a woman whose combination of extraordinary physical presence, natural intelligence, and personal dignity helped to quietly establish the standards by which all future generations of extraordinary performers would eventually come to be measured. And that brings us to the end of today's journey through 26 extraordinary real circus performers that history chose to forget. Every single one of these individuals was a real human being with a real story, real struggles, real achievements, and a real legacy that absolutely deserves to be remembered and honored. They were not myths. They were not monsters. They were extraordinary people who lived extraordinary lives under circumstances that most of us cannot even begin to imagine. If you found their stories as powerful and as fascinating as we did, please make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you are always the first to know when we release a new video. Drop a comment down below and tell us which of these 26 performers left the biggest impression on you. If someone in your life loves history, real stories, or the hidden corners of human experience, share this video with them right now. We will see you in the very next one.